Good evening, good afternoon. First of all, copy out and answer the following GCSE questions. They revisit lessons completed earlier this year. First question, what is the process of changing the shape of the lens to focus on near or distant objects called? If you touch a hot object, you pull your hand away. This can be an example of reflex action. Display fully how the different structures of the nervous system bring about this reflex action. Today we're looking at the control of blood glucose. That will include the role of the pancreas and obviously how important the pancreas is to blood glucose concentration, how insulin control blood glucose levels in the body, and how glycogen and insulin interact to control blood glucose levels, and what causes diabetes. Today's keywords are insulin, diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2. So first of all, what is glucose? And name some uses. Can you also name two things that can cause the change in blood glucose levels to rise? So glucose is a complex carbohydrate which comes from our food. Obviously in plants, it's due to the reaction in leaves with carbon dioxide and water. Glucose is a complex carbohydrate and along with oxygen is vital in aerobic respiration. It is vital. Obviously, if we do not have enough glucose, we cannot actually respire correctly. And we also relate and link osmosis to glucose because obviously without water levels in the body being correct, we actually can't get the solubles that we want into our cells. So obviously the energy cannot correctly be made. And glucose is a vital component to help with homeostasis, keeping us balanced from the point of view of obviously the correct sugar levels and also with regards to other actions within the actual cell. So what actually causes blood glucose levels to rise and fall? Okay, that's time up. Go to the next slide and we'll talk through the actual process of what happens after we eat and what happens to the digestive system and glucose. So we eat our meals. Obviously meals can consist of lots of other components which are broken down, such as amino acids, which are broken down obviously from proteins, carbohydrates, which are complex sugars, lipids, which are broken down into fatty acids, and obviously glycerol. So food obviously which is key for aerobic respiration is glucose, and that is obviously broken down in the mitochondria within the cells. If you aren't familiar with the mitochondria, you should pause this clip now and take a few minutes to revisit any revision guides for the role of the mitochondria in aerobic respiration. So we eat our food. The first particular enzyme within the body is amylase. It takes obviously the glucose from our diet and the carbohydrates start to break down in the mouth. If you want to see how this actually works, if you take a piece of white bread or brown bread from a supermarket and start to chew it, you should notice when the saliva starts that it will start to become sweet. The carbohydrates obviously are broken down into the glucose. They go through the digestive system and into the small intestine. You should look obviously at the small intestine. Why obviously the hyphodes and the villi allow for the increased surface area for that transportation of glucose into the actual bloodstream. Levels in the bloodstream obviously rise, and that is quite rapid. You'll often notice if you have a biscuit or a sweet drink, you will actually feel quite energized for up to about 20 minutes after you've eaten or drunk what we call processed sugars. Unfortunately, these are an artificial high and you will crash quite quickly. So foods with a low glycemic index, such as oats, such as grapes, all actually release energy slower. However, glucose is a huge molecule and it cannot get out of the bloodstream easily. So to do that, it uses first of all, insulin. Insulin is released from the pancreas, from some special cells within the actual pancreas themselves. It then picks up and carries the glucose into the respiring tissue. And that picking up and taking it to the respiring tissue is a really important requirement for negative feedback and for maintaining correct sugar levels within the body. Obviously, if we cannot and our pancreas isn't working correctly, insulin cannot be picked up and carried into respiring tissue, and you end up with too much free sugar in the bloodstream. This obviously can be the first stages for diabetes type 1. People know they've got diabetes type 1 because they'll have ketones, amino acids, and it'll make their breath smell unusual, quite strong, or they'll need to repeatedly go to the bathroom to urinate. You should take time now to use your revision guides or BBC Bite Size to look at the role of the pancreas and see whether there are any named cells that are involved in that for GCSE. At A level, you would need to understand the beta and alpha cells within the pancreas and how they relate to obviously cells called the islets of Langerhans, which are key for actually the production and the release of the hormone insulin. Today, insulin is genetically modified, and that is to help obviously with cultural issues and also to help with the fact of supply and demand. So diabetes obviously is a worldwide problem and it is continuing to rise. Reasons for that we do not know. But as I say, pause this video now and take time to go and research the pancreas. You should at this stage have found that obviously the hormone insulin is to return sugar levels, glucose levels back to normal and make sure there are no excess sugars, glucose within the actual bloodstream, which is harmful to the individual. Now there are times when we can actually take on too much excess glucose. Now glucose, it is vital glucose is not left in the bloodstream. Too much glucose in the bloodstream has a problem and results in impacts on osmosis. Osmosis obviously affects the movement of water in and out of cells. So obviously what you should now be doing is, if you cannot remember, is to revisit osmosis and what effect too much water has in cells. You should be looking at to see if we're looking at isotonic, hypertonic or hypotonic, and see what them particular phrases, definitions mean with regards to the GCSE syllabus. So the liver is key for metabolism and catabolism. There are two new terms there which you should look at if you cannot recall from your year one scheme. So liver is key for obviously the breakdown of the organisms, and also helps with obviously detoxifying the body. But we can have diets where excess glucose is taken on board. So therefore the liver is vital for converting that glucose into insoluble glycogen. Glycogen is a complex carbohydrate. Glycogen is really important and can be actually broken down by glucagon when blood glucose levels are low, because it is very important that blood glucose levels can always be called upon for respiration. So glycogen is stored, it's excess carbohydrate, excess glucose, and it is vital that it can be broken down by the hormone glucagon in cases of anaerobic respiration. If your glycogen stores in the liver and muscles are full, the excess glucose is converted into lipids and stored. So if you regularly take in food with more glucose than the liver and muscles can store, you may become obese, a little bit too cuddly for some. This is why people drinking lots of Coke, which have about 10 teaspoons of sugar, them nice Costa coffees, and frequently doing that and having a sedentary lifestyle can actually become harmful to the actual body itself. Before we go on to the next slide, you should have printed off, if possible, or have gone to slide with obviously how does the body control the internal conditions. It's at the end of this particular presentation. So we actually eat our meal. During the day, if pancreas is working correctly and the insulin can naturally be released, we can obviously ensure that blood glucose levels are kept at a constant. But obviously when we eat a meal, our blood glucose level rises. To obviously assist with this, the pancreas adds insulin into the blood. Insulin is a transport hormone, obviously needs a little bit of energy itself, so this process is a type of active transport process within the body. The release of the insulin, if there is too much if there's too much glucose released, it is vital that that is taken out of the bloodstream. So to do that, that glucose is converted to glycogen in the liver. This helps keep, with negative feedback, the actual properties of keeping a normal blood glucose level. If, however, the body undertakes exercise and hasn't had a recent intake of food, if we're not careful, we'll end up with anaerobic respiration starting. This obviously, as you know, is not as effective as aerobic respiration. If you can't remember the difference between aerobic and anaerobic, you should take time to pause this clip now and research your information on aerobic and anaerobic respiration, you should know the two equations for anaerobic and aerobic respiration in animals, in humans particularly, and you should also look at what forms in anaerobic respiration when there isn't sufficient ATP. So we do exercise, and when we do exercise, our blood glucose levels go down. So at this stage, it is really important that the pancreas can ensure that glucagon is actually released into the bloodstream. So to do that, the glycogen in the liver is actually converted back to glucose. And obviously, this ends that we have normal blood glucose levels within the body at all times. Obviously, when we do not get sufficient, when that glycogen hormone has been added to convert the glycogen, quite complicated words really, have to say them carefully. If it doesn't break down, then obviously we have an issue with too little glucose in the blood, and we could end up with a hypoglycemic reaction in the body. This is the answers to the previous slide. Hopefully you are able to do that. If not, pause the video now and take a brief moment to write this down. Make sure you understand the difference between glycogen and glucagon. Glucagon is a hormone which breaks down glycogen in the liver and converts it into glucose, ready for use after exercise to help prevent anaerobic respiration. There are times when it goes wrong. Pancreas doesn't function properly. When that happens, we could end up with diabetes type 1. Diabetes type 1 can be fatal. If you haven't already done so, you should be researching diabetes type 1 and type 2 and how these are actually controlled. Diabetes type 1 can be resolved by using insulin injections, and people who are diabetic, it is vital that they control their sugar levels to ensure that it doesn't damage the rest of their organs. So in diabetes type 1, the kidneys actually start to be affected, and they will start to excrete ketones and glucose into your urine. This actually makes you produce a lot of urine. It also makes you feel extremely thirsty. And it doesn't enable any glucose to be carried into your cells. You are permanently tired. Your body will actually start to break down any proteins and the fat within the body to use as fuel, and you end up losing weight. Generally, the diagnosis for diabetes type 1 is in young children or teenagers, but there can be a genetic element as you start to get older and your organs are not as effective. Diabetes type 2 tends to be more common in older people. Unfortunately, the UK and the US have the highest numbers of diabetes type 2 cases. It is linked to obesity, it is linked to our lifestyle, and obviously the changes that are needed to actually control diabetes type 2 is that people do have a lifestyle change. However, with regards to diabetes type 2, the pancreas still makes insulin, but it does not make sufficient insulin, and also your cells stop to respond to the insulin that you actually make. So therefore, we have no way of obviously taking that glucose into our respiring cells. It becomes converted into that fat, and that's why the obesity tends to rise. The UK has the highest number of cases, and unfortunately we're seeing this in children as young as 5. Obviously, the impact to the health, you should refer back to lifestyle and health conditions from from paper or year 1 to look at lifestyle choices and how that can actually affect the body from the point of view of the heart, joints, and obviously the well-being of an individual. So that's the end of the lesson. Let's just see how happy you feel with regard to that with a quick quiz. I would like you to answer glucose, glycogen or glucagon for the next slides. It's a hormone. You should add glucagon. It's an insoluble carbohydrate. Glycogen. It's produced by the pancreas. Glucagon. It's soluble. It's stored in the liver and muscles. Glycogen. It's made from protein. Glucagon. It's used for respiration. Glucose. It makes the liver break down its stores. Glycagon. It comes from the food we eat. Glucose. It's a complex carbohydrate. Glycogen. These are today's keywords. You should take a moment to note these keywords and make flashcards or revision notes to understand how these words relate to blood glucose and control of blood glucose within the human body. That ends the presentation. Thank you.